So, after the United States Army had moved to attack Native American resources, including the buffalo, in a way to weaken Native American resistance to Western settler expansion, the next move is to move Native Americans out of their traditional homelands and to what we call reservations, or areas of land set aside for use by Native Americans, because the US government and white settlers wanted this choice land occupied by Native Americans and could not have it until Native Americans had been dispossessed or kicked off the land. The Army is enlisted to pursue Native tribes trying to evade capture and relocation. And the Army specifically is targeted with doing this because if they defeated them, then the terms of surrender included forcing land to go into U.S. government ownership, and then again agreeing to go onto these relatively small reservations on less desirable land. One example of a Native American leader who had tried to evade his people being kicked off their land and shoved onto a reservation is Chief Joseph, the leader of the Nez Perce tribe in the Pacific Northwest. The Nez Perce tried to evade U.S. General O.O. Howard by just moving across the Pacific Northwest over a distance of 1,700 miles before and 4 months before Howard finally defeated the Nez Perce and relocated them to a reservation in Oklahoma. Chief Joseph led a powerful appeal in Washington after his people had been relocated, arguing that the freedom and the rights of Native Americans was being violated by having their land seized and forcing them to live on these tiny reservations. Another Native American leader who resisted, U.S. Army and government incursion is Sitting Bull, who's a leader of the Sioux. Sitting Bull, along with Crazy Horse, led an early victory over the U.S. Army at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 when they defeated General George Armstrong Custer. The Battle of Little Bighorn only happened because the U.S. government, which had recognized the area as belonging to the Sioux Nation in 1868, had failed to uphold the terms of the treaty, which that land was the Sioux, after gold was discovered. And so when the Sioux were trying to push these gold diggers out of their area, the U.S. Army stepped in to try to prevent them from doing that, and the Battle of Little Bighorn happened. Unfortunately, the Battle of Little Bighorn would be the last sort of major victory against the U.S. Army by Native Americans. We see the rapid decline of Native American power in the West. Nomadic bands like the Comanche and the Apache managed to hold out for a little longer just by virtue of not being tied to particular homelands. But even they ended up forced on reservations by the 1880s. This is a particularly hard fate for the Comanche, who had been one of the more powerful groups in the American Southwest, maintaining their own empire and enlisting other tribes as subject peoples, and also getting fairly wealthy by levying taxes on trade routes like the Santa Fe Trail, which had connected Mexico with Missouri. So, as Native Americans are moved to reservations, we have a shift in how Native Americans are dealt with. Prior to this time period, Native Americans are dealt with by the federal government and they're treated as independent nations who should be dealt with according to a treaty system. So, in other words, the Sioux are treated much like the United States would treat like France. Okay, they're seen as a foreign nation. You got to conduct diplomacy with them. But in 1871, the United States government does away with that. They eliminate the treaty system and they establish the Bureau of Indian Affairs. part of the reason they do this is if they no longer recognize Native Americans as sovereign independent nations, then they can more easily take their land and force them onto reservations. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs goes farther than that. The goal is not only to take Native American land that is seen as desirable and give it to white settlers, but also to remake Native American culture and to assimilate them into white mainstream American culture. And if you're going to change the culture of any group of people, the best place to start is with children. And boarding schools are set up for Native American children, most infamously places like Carlisle. And children are shipped off to these boarding schools away from their families. They are educated in reading and writing. They are forced to dress like white Americans. They cannot speak their native language. They're forced to adopt white names. They're encouraged to convert to Christianity. And the people running these schools believe they're doing what is in the best interest of these children by educating them in Western society, by preparing them to succeed in Western society. But they're doing that at the expense of these children's culture and connection to family. And today, as of this recording in 2021, we're facing a little bit more of a reckoning. Canada, our northern neighbor, has started investigating former sites of boarding schools and found mass graves of children who died of disease or other causes there. And similarly, our Secretary Haaland, Deb Haaland, has ordered a similar review of Native American boarding school sites in the United States. So I'm sure more will come out of that after this recording. The Dawes Act in 1887 further eats away at Native American lands by arguing that land should only be granted to Native Americans who were willing to adopt a more American lifestyle of small-scale farming. And for those who didn't want to do this, the remaining land would be seized and then sold for profit. So because of the Dawes Act, which is basically reallocating land they believe is not being used properly by Native Americans, Native American land ownership goes from 138 million acres in 1887 to 52 million acres by 1941. Why didn't Native Americans simply do what most Americans do in times of stress or if they feel their rights have been violated? Why don't they sue, right? The lawsuits are a grand tradition in American history. Well, the problem is, as of 1884, in the Supreme Court case of Elk v. Wilkins, the Supreme Court ruled that Native Americans were not citizens. Even though the 14th Amendment, which was passed in the wake of the Civil War, had guaranteed birthright citizenship. In other words, if you're born on United States territory, you're automatically a United States citizen. The United States Supreme Court said that did not apply to Native Americans. They also said that the voting rights, which are guaranteed by the 15th Amendment, which said you could not restrict the ability to vote based on race, also passed in the wake of the Civil War. The Supreme Court ruled that that did not apply to Native Americans either. So if Native Americans wanted to become American citizens, they had to become naturalized. So they had to go through the same process as immigrants did to become citizens. In the case of Native Americans, if they wanted to get American citizenship, they were required to leave their tribal reservations and to assimilate into white culture before they were allowed to apply for citizenship. Unsurprisingly, this is not seen as an attractive option by many Native Americans, and by 1900, only 53,000 had become citizens under these terms. The citizenship issue for Native Americans is not fixed until 1924, when Congress finally passes a law saying, our bad, Native Americans are citizens clearly under the 14th Amendment. But for decades, Native Americans are not seen as citizens, and therefore they don't have the same rights to contest ill treatment. as American citizens. In the face of all of this change in the West, all of this dispossession of land, stripping of culture, decline of power, many Native Americans turned to religion and spirituality. And we see this in earlier waves of American history too, when we see the reaction to the first wave of Western settlers when the American colonies are still British. And Pontiac, right? Pontiac's rebellion, led by visions of the prophet Neolin of wanting to cleanse the land of white people. Or even later, the Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, who had a similar vision of returning to Native American cultural roots and hopefully getting rid of white people as a way to maintain cultural purity. That starts as well in the early 1800s. And so we see a desire to return to Native ways of life, to Native religion, but also a willingness to embrace what we call a pan-Indian identity. Because even though Native American is a label that we use today to describe all indigenous peoples in the United States, that's not how they identified themselves for a very long time. Instead, they identified themselves as Chickasaw or Sioux or, excuse me, Cherokee. They would not have identified themselves as having a common umbrella identity like we put them under today. But in times of incursion by white people and pressure, there's more of a willingness to see that they have a shared kind of common goal, right? Shared experiences and shared goals. And among many Great Plains tribes, one of the things they turned to cope with all of this loss were religious ceremonies called ghost dances. Ghost dances were prayers sent up to the gods to restore native life to the way it had before, to return their lands to them, to allow the return of the buffalo, which was nearly extinct by the 1880s. White settlers saw these ghost dances as threatening because they didn't understand them. They didn't understand that this was a ritual prayer, and to them, Native Americans praying for white people to go away sounded like a threat of violence. And so many white settlers and the government saw these ghost dances as subversive and acts of rebellion. And in 1890, at Wounded Knee, the army attacks a Lakota Sioux ghost dance, killing somewhere between 150 and 200 Native Americans, mostly women and children, in attendance at this ghost dance meeting. So by the end of the 1890s, Native Americans have largely been pushed off of their native lands. They've been shoved onto reservations. Their culture is perpetually challenged by things like boarding schools for their children or being told they can't get citizenship in the United States unless they give up their culture. It sounds really depressing because it is. And if you look at the percentage of land that is occupied and controlled by Native Americans from the founding of the United States in the early 1780s as a nation to 1900, it looks very dire. And the process really accelerates if you look at GIFs like Native American Land GIF. If you're watching the video version of this, it looks really bad, especially after the Civil War. There's this huge acceleration in land dispossession. I do have news for you. It will get better. It takes a while, but today when we look at things like census data, we are seeing Native American populations rebounding. We are seeing a move to reconnect with culture and to address this period of Native American history, as we mentioned with the boarding schools, right, and the review of boarding school property by Secretary Haaland. Native Americans still have many challenges when you look at demographics today, like a much higher poverty rate compared to the general population in the United States. But at the very least, things haven't gotten catastrophically worse. I wish I could say more cheerful things. But particularly more recently, there is a measure of more justice done for Native Americans. And hopefully we'll continue to see a willingness to talk about this time period and the issues facing Native Americans as time goes on. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.